For many people, the recent decision from Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger to actually withdraw from the ECOWAS is merely a decision that is comprehended from the perception or from the perspective of being a good move or a wrong move. But what if there is actually more to it? What if the decision made from these three West African countries stem from more than a mere appreciation that is actually about right or wrong? In the previous episode, I started discussing this decision from the lenses of trying to understand the negative impact of coups in terms of political stability, but also in terms of adversely impacting the development agenda in Africa. In this episode, we are going to delve straight into the topic and start understanding the true meaning of the recent decision from these three West African countries. Welcome to your favorite podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African. I'm S.I.K.A, and as always, I'm happy to be with you today. If you're not yet a member of our amazing community of African intellectuals, I invite you to click on the subscribe button and to also activate the ring bell so that you don't miss out on the very interesting upcoming episode. On the 27th of January 2024, amidst the African Cup of Nations, the world heard a very shocking news, but not surprising. It was not a surprise news, but it was very shocking. Very shocking because it came from one of the oldest members of the West African Economic Community, which is called the ECOWAS. The ECOWAS was actually created since 1975, and as I'm saying, one of the oldest members of ECOWAS were Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso. Unfortunately, at the end of January 2024, these three countries decided to leave the ECOWAS after being a member for almost 50 years. I'm sure you understand that these are not the kind of decisions you make on a whim. Imagine being married to your partner for 50 years and waking up one day and asking or filing for divorce. This is surely not a decision that you've made lightly, but I'm pretty sure you've actually considered some parameters. You've also been through a set of circumstances and events that probably led you to making such a bold and shocking decision after, sharing almost half of your lifespan with the same partner. So this is the same analysis we should make, from the beginning. That's what I was saying, that there's always more to it. This kind of decision cannot be considered as good or wrong just from one optics. There's always more optics, to consider. So let's look at the first true meaning of this decision. As I was saying, you'll notice that the three West African countries were long-time members of the ECOWAS. So in my opinion, the first meaning of this decision that we need to keep in mind is that it is not an action-based decision, but it is more a reaction-based decision. What's the difference and why is that? Well, the key difference here is that you do not have countries that decided overnight to actually leave the ECOWAS. That's the first element. The second element, like I was saying, when making the example of couples, I am pretty sure that there was, or there were a series of events that actually led to that unfortunate outcome. And in our context, we are all aware that it was actually stemming from the previous coups that taken place in Mali since 2020, in Burkina Faso since 2022, and in Niger since 2023. Well, in those countries, the key argument, brought to the fore by the military juntas was the argument around the threat of national security. We need to keep in mind that all three countries are actually facing severe rise of jihadism and terrorism. thousands of Malians, thousands of people from Burkina Faso and Niger have actually died since the surge of jihadism and terrorism. So the argument about or around national security may be a valid argument, but we also need to consider that argument, at a country level. When looking at the context in Mali, the rise of jihadism and terrorism, took place since 2012. Over 10 years, down the line, the Malian authorities, especially the military authorities, consider that they have not seen the progress that they were expecting, especially with the existence of international support and also with the existence of regional and local support. The previous president, Ibrahim Boubacar Keïta, who was actually elected through through a democratic process, according to them, failed to actually restore the national security and the national integrity of the entire territory. So these are actually the key argument brought to the fore. In Burkina Faso, the same argument also were actually used to try and vindicate the incurrence of the military takeovers. But when it comes to Niger, I personally tend to disagree with that argument that was also played by the military juntas in Niger. Why? Yes, Niger is also facing the same military and the same security threat when it comes to national security and the national integrity of the national territory. But in my opinion, President Mohamed Bazoum just got elected and he hasn't run the country for at least 1 year. So we're talking here about a president who was democratically, elected by the people, but unfortunately who did not have, the necessary time to be able, to assess the situation and to implement the necessary, solutions to make sure that they can deal with the terrorism and the threat of jihadism. So in the Niger case, I suspect that the military juntas were actually, seizing or had actually seized power thanks to the national security threat, but they were also trying to promote a personal or, an external agenda. We can discuss that later, which actually brings me to my analysis when I say the decision is a reaction-based decision because, as you notice, in all three countries, they had one key argument. The argument is not enough to actually justify, the occurrence of a military takeovers, but at least it is something they can use and they can hide behind if they want to gain, general support, especially from the local population. So faced with that kind of situation, what could West African authorities do? The ECOWAS decided to actually, implement the full extent of the law on those military juntas, i.e. they decided to remove them or to suspend the three countries from the West African sub-regional instances. They also decided to apply economic sanction, and the latest, original sanction they thought about was to threat, Niger with military forces to actually be able to reinstate President Mohamed Bazoum. So you will see that the decision is not coming from a fair assessment of the economic or the military situation in Mali, in Burkina, and Niger. The decision is not also coming from a diplomatic perspective. The decision is coming merely from the fact that in the junta's mind, the ECOWAS was not in a position to implement all these sanctions. That's the first argument. The second argument, they are also saying that ECOWAS was not within the right, legally speaking, to also think and even implement those kind of sanctions. The third argument is that they are considering ECOWAS as no longer representing the West African interest, or at least their interest. So this is very important to also consider because it is very easy to blame these countries from, leaving an economic bloc. But at the end of the day, we need to consider the mandate, of that economic bloc. And one of the key mandates of ECOWAS is actually to promote, people integration within the West African community, but to also promote economic growth and economic development for every member state. So you will see that we are in a context where it's very difficult to actually talk about a decision that was made on a whim, because on one hand we had a series of events that occurred on the military junta's side, but we also have a series of events that also occurred on the ECOWAS. And unfortunately, it's the clashing of these two series of events that actually led to that unfortunate outcome. The second aspect we also need to consider is that this decision to actually leave the ECOWAS after almost 50 years stress the key limitation of ECOWAS as a regional organization. And in my opinion, this is one of the most important meaning that we need to keep in mind. Well, it has nothing to do with our emotions, whether we are happy or whether we are not happy with the fact that we are now seeing three African, countries leaving, the community. But it is more about trying to assess the reason why they're leaving. Well, it is never a good solution to actually use military forces to seize power. This is not a solution. But sometimes it is not just it does not just help to focus on the outcome, but you also need to focus on the reasons, on the causes, the sources that actually led to that outcome that you are now facing with. In the case of Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they are strongly considering that the ECOWAS is no longer being able to represent their interest. What interest are we talking about here? Well, ECOWAS, like I said, is an economic organization. ECOWAS is not a political organization. So even considering, the threat to use military force, in my opinion, I think the ECOWAS was slightly overstepping here, because we are talking about an economic organization. As an economic organization, do they have the right to actually use or even consider the use of military force? What about the African Union? Here, I think the right organization who could have been in the position to actually threaten Niger or even Mali and Burkina Faso with the use of military force should have been the AU, not the ECOWAS, because the ECOWAS is an economic organization, not a political organization, which means that the only tools that make sense from an economic perspective were actually tools that have a strong relation or correlation with the economic life of those countries. So it's actually logical for ECOWAS to implement economic sanctions, but it's very debatable for ECOWAS to actually wanting to implement, military forces. And when thinking about that kind of analysis, it tends to reduce your credibility, from your member states, but also at the international level. Another reason that also emphasizes the limit of ECOWAS is the relative application of the law. Remember, in the previous episode, I told you that unfortunately, the African continent, is known for being a continent where political stability is very scarce. Political stability, unfortunately, in Africa is very scarce, and unfortunately, it has become part of a second nature of this continent. So let's look at the series of coups that actually happened in Africa, especially in West Africa, and let's ask ourselves what were the ECOWAS reactions when those coups were actually taking place. Have the ECOWAS ever condemned a West African country led by military juntas, back in those days, and ever implemented any economic sanction on these countries? We can think of Ghana, we can think of Nigeria, we can also think of Cote d'Ivoire, which has been under military control and military powers for almost a year, from December 1999 to October 2000. You can also think of Ghana, you can also think of Nigeria. All of these big shots, in the West African region have been led by military powers. Again, I am not saying that, military takeovers are a good thing, but I am talking here about the credibility of the ECOWAS as an organization. And yes, because they never implemented a type of specific sanction back in those days, does not preclude them from, implementing those sanctions. Yes, I agree with that analysis. But remember, we are talking about the highest level of diplomacy and international relations here. So when dealing with that kind of situation, you need to be very strategic, and you also need to consider precedent, because especially people who are facing the full application of the law will never be happy about the kind of sanction. So as the ruler, as the legislator, you should always think about a way you are going to actually rationalize your decision. So considering all these impacts, it's very difficult, not to address, the credibility of the ECOWAS in terms of applying, a specific or a special legal treatment, when it comes to a specific country, and now applying another form of treatment when it comes to other countries. So this actually is the analysis I wanted to make when talking about, the serious, threat that it creates in terms of the ECOWAS reputation amongst ECOWAS, countries, but also at the international level. The third very important element that we also need to consider when thinking about the true meaning of this decision is to look at the fact that their withdrawal, or their actually willingness to withdraw from the ECOWAS, creates a new bloc, a new power bloc within the West African region. And unfortunately, that power bloc is not, famous because of its economic, its economic performance, but it is unfortunately known because of its political, state and its military stance. So, like it or not, unfortunately, the meaning of this new decision creates a new power dynamic within the West African region. We now have to consider these three states, and especially the alliance that they just created, the Sahelian Alliance of States, in acronym A.E.S, which is going to be, unfortunately, a new reality in West Africa, at least from January 2025. Because according to the ECOWAS bylaws, Article 91 of the revised ECOWAS treaty says that, and I'm going to paraphrase here because I don't have the provision in front of me, but overall, Article 91 actually allows for any member, who wishes to withdraw to actually do so. But that member has to follow, the procedure. And one of the key steps of the procedure is to give a written notice to the executive secretary. And that notice has to be a 1-year notice. But the good thing with that, decision is that it does not take any effect, until the 1-year period is over, which means that it is not too late. Another meaning that we need to consider is that perhaps it is for these three countries to show to the rest of the ECOWAS community that they are really serious about, making true on their promises, at least for the constituents. And again, you may disagree with the revolution that they're trying to make. You may also disagree with the fact that they are willing to leave the ECOWAS. But let's not forget that the ECOWAS is an economic, organization created to actually foster people integration and also foster economic growth. And as a member of that bloc, if you don't feel that your interests are actually being protected the way they should be, of course, you shouldn't raise your concern using such a debatable, means. But I mean, you need to also understand that they are trying to promote a kind of vision that they seem that is working for them. So in my opinion, this decision may be a show of force. They know exactly that they cannot withdraw from ECOWAS until before the 1-year notice period is actually over. And since the ECOWAS was also not willing to dilute or to dial down in terms of their threats that they were applying on these countries, maybe they had to actually clashes like fire with fire. That's actually how you can get listened. So now that the ECOWAS is now willing to sit down at the same table with these people, perhaps we may see a shift in this current, context in which maybe like before January 2025 or before they ever decided to actually submit the written notification to ECOWAS, they come to a term. But overall, I would like us to understand that the true meaning here is that first, we should understand that this decision was not made on a whim, but it's a reaction-based decision. The second key aspect here is that this decision also shows us, the key limitation of ECOWAS in terms of like regional credibility, but also international credibility. And the last true meaning or the last, key element to also keep in mind is that, like it or not, it creates, a new power block within the West African region. Now the question is, do we need that power block to subsist, or do we need that power block to actually disappear so that we can all, have one West African bloc as it used to be before the 27th of January 2024. Let me know what you think of this analysis. Let me know if you can also think of like other key meaning, in terms of assessing this decision. Thank you for listening to your favorite podcast, Smart, Intellectual, Knowledgeable African, the podcast where strong realities always meet powerful perspectives. À bientôt.